Is the Old Testament the first half of the Bible? How's that for an easy question? Is the Old Testament the first half of the Bible? You know the answer, don't you? When I teach a 90-minute Old Testament overview, I jokingly ask everyone for a show of hands yes to that question. But guess what? Almost everyone puts their hand up and gets the answer wrong. You see, it's not the first half of the Bible, it's the first 3/4 of the Bible. Are you shaking your head and laughing a little? I hope so. But seriously, if I asked you to give me a 5-minute overview of the Old Testament, could you? And could you tell me how the books of the Old Testament are organized? Well, most Christians couldn't. So I'm going to do something you probably think is impossible. I'm going to explain the whole Old Testament in about 10 minutes, just to show you how simple it really is. Stay with me. It'll be a fun ride. Let's start with less than 2 minutes on the order of the Old Testament's 39 books. Remember these numbers, 5, 9, and 3, 5, 5, 9, and 3. That's 5, 9, 3, 5, 5, 9, 3. That's the order of the Old Testament books. 5, 9, and 3 history books, then 5 poetry books, and then 5, 9, and 3 books of the prophets. That's the order. 5, 9, and 3 history books, 5 poetry books, and 5, 9, and 3 books of the prophets. There's 5 history books from creation to the edge of Canaan. Then there's 9 history books in Canaan before the 70-year exile, then 3 books going back into Canaan after the exile. Then there are the 5 poetry books of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. The rest of the Old Testament is 5, 9, and 3 books of the prophets. There's 5 major prophets before and during the 70-year exile, then 9 minor prophets before the exile, and 3 minor prophets after the exile. Oh, and the minor prophets weren't shorter guys or less important than the major prophets. They just wrote shorter books. So that's the order: 5, 9, and 3 history books, 5 poetry books, and 5, 9, and 3 books of the prophets. 5, 9, 3, 5, 5, 9, 3. Now, let's take a 5-minute trip through Old Testament history. Buckle up. The Old Testament starts in Genesis with the beginning of the human race and then the beginning of Israel. The beginning of the human race is seen in 4 historic events: the creation, the fall, the flood, and the confusion of language at the Tower of Babel. The beginning of Israel is seen in 4 heroic men: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who's renamed Israel, and Joseph. That's great-grandfather, grandfather, father, and 11th son. The 12 sons of Jacob are known as the 12 tribes of Israel. After Joseph died at the end of Genesis and then in the beginning of Exodus, the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt for 430 years. After 350 years of that enslavement, Moses was born, and then at age 80, after his 40 years tending sheep in the wilderness, he led the Israelites out of Egypt. During the Exodus, God gave them the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. Genesis is the book of beginnings, the genesis of the human race, and the genesis of Israel. Exodus is about the Exodus, the exiting of Israel from Egypt and from under their laws. The 3rd book of the Old Testament is Leviticus. It's about the Levitical priests of Israel and the laws of God. Numbers is about, well, you guessed it, it's about numbers. It records a first and second census of Israel. The first census was before their refusal to enter Canaan and before their consequential 40 years of death and wandering in the wilderness. After those 40 years, they were numbered again. That was the second census. Before they entered Canaan, Moses gave them the law of God a second time. In Latin, it would be for the second law, Deuteronomos. In the Old Testament, it's Deuteronomy. The generation of the unfaithful had died off, so the rest of Israel were due to remember the laws of God. Get it? Deuteronomy, due to remember. Then Joshua led the Israelites into Canaan to conquer the evil people who lived there, and then to divide the land among the 12 tribes of Israel. It was a time of success. Following Joshua, there were 17 cycles of failure. They're recorded in Judges and 1 Samuel. The Israelites sinned. God judged them through enemy oppression. The Israelites repented. God sent a judge, a military deliverer, to rescue them. Peace followed. Then the people forgot and went back to their sinful ways. And the cycle began again and again and again for 330 years. That's 17 cycles of failure and 17 second chances. After the time of the judges, the Israelites wanted a human king like everyone else had. They wanted man's rule, monarchy, rather than God's rule, theocracy. God gave them 3 kings: Saul, then David, and then Solomon. After Solomon's rule, the single kingdom of Israel split into 2. The northern kingdom, then known as Israel, was ruled by 19 bad kings. After that, the northern kingdom, Israel, was taken into Assyria and dispersed. The southern kingdom, known as Judah, was ruled by a mix of 19 good and bad kings and a queen. The history of the kings and kingdoms is found in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Notice that those books are in reverse alphabetical order. After Jerusalem fell and the temple was destroyed, the southern kingdom, Judah, was taken into exile in Babylonia. After 70 years of that exile, when Babylonia fell to Persia, they returned to Jerusalem in 3 waves. Zerubbabel led the first wave back to rebuild the temple. Ezra brought the second wave back to rebuild the people. He brought spiritual revival. Then Nehemiah brought the final wave back to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. The 3 returns are documented in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. The story of Esther, the Jewish queen of Persia, completes the 5, 9, and 3 books of Old Testament history. That's it. That's the history recorded in the Old Testament. I've taken you through this short overview to show you that Old Testament history is really pretty simple. I know in one viewing of this video, you won't remember it all. Watching it a few more times can help. And there's a free 17-page document that's an extremely useful resource. It's got all the stuff I've said. It's got a lot more detail. It's got maps and charts and a flow chart of Old Testament history. And the 16th page of that resource has a great chart that only left-brained people like me can appreciate. You really should check that resource out. It's in the justaquestion.org Library of Documents. It's simply titled The Old Testament. There's enough detail in it so that you'll probably want to print it or read it on something bigger than your phone. The Old Testament is the first 3 quarters of the Bible. It's very important. You should spend some serious study time in it. As the Apostle Paul wrote, referring to the Old Testament, "For whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope." I'm John Morris. I'll see you on the next Just a Question.